to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisen. I am the host of Inside Personal Growth and have been for 17 years and over 1,200 podcasts. And joining us from Del Mar, and I got to let my listeners know, but it's actually Cortney McDermott. And this is the book, Give Yourself Permission. I actually have been able to meet with her twice because we live pretty close to one another. That doesn't always happen, Court. How are you today?
Same. I'm well. I'm so well. How are you? And thank you for having me here. I'm excited to talk. Yeah.
Well, you're fired up, I can tell. So I love that. And I love the fact that we're going to get into something that will really help our listeners um, in in their life journey. And I think giving themselves permission to be confident, be happy, and be you is truly it. But before we start in to that, I'm going to let them know just a little bit about you because I've learned so much about you over our time sitting together having coffee and having lunch the other day. And I was so kind of enamored with your background. I think that my listeners will be as well. So let me tell you a bit about her. She's a best-selling author, a TEDx speaker, and a mind-body expert with a master's of science from the London School of Economics. Her work in the field of self development and business strategy has been featured in Women's Health, Success, The Huffington Post, Fox News, and many other mainstream business and lifestyle media. Um, Courtney's career highlights include her time as an executive at Vanity Fair Corporation. She was also vice president of Sustainable Partners, Inc., and then running her own business with clients and audiences at Universal Music Group, Google, Nike, and Virgin Unite. She speaks 4 languages and lives between Italy and the US, recently transplanted to Del Mar, California. Uh, you can connect with Courtney, and it's not Cour, it's Cortney, McDermott, McDermott.com. There you can learn more about her books. You can learn about her speaking, what she does. You will also put links to her LinkedIn page and anywhere that you need to find her on social media. So, Court, can I call you Court?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Because we've had such a great opportunity to spend at least a couple of hours together, which I always say is kind of unusual. Give yourself permission is really kind of a powerful title because so many of us don't give ourselves permission and we fall into what society wants us to become or do or be.
Mhm.
And we don't actually live this life of happiness and fulfillment. We live a life that was like expected of us by our parents or our boss or whoever it might be. What was the moment or experience in your life that inspired you, one, to write this book, and two, for you to find your own self and give yourself permission? Because you didn't always give yourself permission either.
No. Yeah. And I feel like I'm constantly having to move that marker in terms of the permission granted to myself of, oh, wow, maybe I can do this. And that experimenting process has been really exciting for me too. And the book came as a kind of a download actually. And I think in part because of the experiences that I had had working with so many quote unquote high performers. And then also in my own life of noticing that lots of times where we weren't showing up for something or where we didn't believe that we could, it was because we weren't giving ourselves this permission, because precisely to your point, we were afraid of how others would respond to it, how we were thinking we kind of had to stay within the confines of what we had either created for ourselves or what had been created for us. So when the inspiration came for this book, it was like, give yourself permission. And these are the different areas to sort of give yourself permission in. And I noticed how funny it was that here I was working with people at the absolute top of their game, but all of us were still struggling with this piece. And so that's where the inspiration came from. And like I said, I'm still very much always challenging my own self in this regard of, well, are you why aren't you giving yourself permission? And it's funny the title of that book because so many of my friends now they say, "Cord, just give yourself permission," right? Like give yourself permission to do this thing. So yeah,
Uh,
that's where it came from.
had a prior book, which was Change Starts Within You. And I think really, look, there's a correlation between the two. Um, Change does start within all of us. And your journey has taken you from being in these roles at executive at Vanity Fair to being an author to now being a transformational coach. Um, and so if you were to tell our listeners, like, hey, oh boy, I jumped off and I know it was afraid to leave Vanity Fair because I might have had my own fears. And then I jumped into this and I became an author. And boy, I was afraid because I didn't know if I was going to sell books or I was going to get speaking engagements or be on TEDx. How did you approach giving yourself permission? And how did you get I'm just going to say it, courage to say, hey, I give myself permission to do this? Or and then there's a second part to that is the whole spiritual element that you bring to the table, which is so incredibly valuable. And I think once people see the value of connecting with their higher self, they realize that they are being guided by a force which is beyond them. They just need to tap in.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
how did you that's a long roundabout way to getting to the question, but the question is, hey, you were there once. A lot of these listeners are there now. What advice are you going to give the listeners that's like, hey, I want to hear what she has to say.
Yeah. Well, I think it was Warren Buffett who said, "Don't test the depths of the water with both feet." In other words, don't just dive in and hope for the best. And there have definitely been times where I've jumped and hoped for the net, but I don't actually counsel that usually. What I say is just piecemeal, dip your toes in, start playing with this. So I remember when I was an executive at Vanity Fair Corporation, I wanted to do some training. My boss kind of wouldn't let me do it, and I thought there was this option to submit a research proposal, and if they liked it, they would accept it and let you go to this conference pretty much free of charge. And so I thought, well, why not give it a shot? And so I did this in my spare time, in my evenings, on the weekends, where I could carve out a little bit of time to follow that impulse, that creative nudge that was nudging me of wanting to write. And when so I did this, I went to the conference. I thought my paper was total crap, and then it ended up winning the best paper award. So I was really shocked by that. And it sort of catapulted my career into this other area of the business, which was around corporate responsibility, and then that sort of took on a life of its own. So it was having, to your point, the courage to do something, but I also did it sort of piecemeal. So it wasn't, "Okay, now I'm gonna quit my job and go write." It was, "Let me see what little pieces are calling out to me." And as to your point that you made in there, there's this force that's working through us. And a lot of people might say, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about." Well, if that comes up for anyone, it's the same force that's conducting the trillions of biochemical reactions occurring in your body every second, right? No one would negate that that force is working for us. It's beating our hearts. It's doing all these other things that we don't consciously have to be aware of. That force will start to take on everything else once you give it the space to do it and stop clogging up the system. So that's what a lot of what I talk about.
Well, it's kind of like taking a journey through the jungle and clearing out the pathway, with a machete. And as you said, it's one step at a time, but in essence, you still have to clear the way the shrubs to be able to get, to where you're going. And, an accolade for you is Nelson Mandela's, was it his daughter who made this?
It's
It
his
says,
grandson. Mhm.
grandson. It says, all you have to do is look into Courtney's eyes and she's figured something out. Her gift is helping the rest of us figure it out too. And I would say that's true. There is
Mm.
something about your eyes. And when you look into your eyes, Court, there's a deepness, there's a richness, there's a something there. And I think for my listeners, whether they get it verbally or they're watching this on video, I think that they'll sense that. It's like you gotta have another sense. So, one of the things I wanted to say was you emphasize in this book that we are already where we need to be.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. But that isn't a belief that a lot of people are carrying around because they're always striving for something else. They're always striving for the next. So,
Mm.
how can people shift their mindset from striving to arriving, as you say?
I love that. I've heard striving to thriving, but I love this, what you just said, striving to arriving. Wow. Yeah, well, here's the thing, all of these potentials that we talk about, they exist in the field, and you can look at that scientifically. I mean, we can look at this from an epigenetic standpoint of you're either signaling some genes or you're not, and you're activating and signaling, learning how to do that. You can look at it from a quantum physics perspective of a particle as a wave at the same time. It's a wave up into the point of observation, i.e. attention, at which point is translated into a particle, into the physical form. And so it's this idea, right, that these potentials are there, and it's only in the moment that we alight the attention with our attention that that probability outcome can start to make itself present or make itself even visible, right? And so since I had started to see this in my own life and with my own experience and working with so many clients, and also after giving talks and speeches all over the world, seeing how people were starting to essentially alight these potentials or these probability outcomes that before they didn't seem to have access to. I really started to play around with the science because I wanted to understand, well, if this is happening and if I'm seeing it, how do we start doing that? And so the striving piece, the striving to arriving, I love that, is that's the piece that's actually kind of holding you back. And it's a funny thing because in the world, or in society, I should say, we talk about, make it happen, and we sort of glorify this idea that you have to keep striving and hustling. And by the way, hustle is such a funny word. It's kind of to means to cheat, right? If you look it up as a dictionary definition, it'll talk about kind of this cheating thing. And you are sort of cheating yourself because what's happening as you're striving is you're activating a lot of stress hormones, you're activating a lot of chemical responses in the brain and the body that are hindering your progress. Whereas when you relax into the potential, what's happening is you're shifting brainwave frequencies. So you're starting to get into frequencies that are more conducive with alighting that probability outcome. And you're starting to just open up to possibility. And so, what I really wanted people to see through my work, because I had experienced it firsthand, was like, oh my God, you could just wake up. People talk about it being a journey, but actually, it doesn't have to be this great journey. You could just wake up like you wake up from a bad dream. And so that's where that was coming from. Yeah.
Well, you blend science and spirituality in this book, and I think it's bridging the gap for most people because a lot of people are skeptical. I know when we had lunch, she said, "Look, if you just can't sit for 5 minutes with yourself, right, or 10 minutes, or 15, or 20, um, you're always then looking to the next, the next,
Mhm,
the next to trigger some other thing that you have to do." But
mhm,
actually giving yourself permission to relax and enjoy who you are and love yourself for who you are
mm,
it's a big deal. I mean, one of the things is forgiveness and self-forgiveness, right? Like forgiving the fact that, well, I didn't become what my parents thought I was going to become or my boss wanted me to be or whatever.
mm,
But I did become who I am. And I'm okay with who I am, right? So, how do you bridge this gap between the two, spirituality and science, for people who are listening right now that might have a bit of skepticism about the two? Because you've just talked about energy waves and you talked about quantum physics and you talked about a few things that I'm not saying all the listeners are going to be like, hey, I get what she's talking about. But there's going to be some that are still going to say, nah, it's all done through hard work and next.
mm. Yeah, well, here's the thing about relaxing, right? And we get fresh. I remember years ago people saying, just relax. And I would say, I am relaxed, right? And I totally wasn't relaxed. My nervous system was on overdrive and all the things. And if we look around and we can kind of sense this in ourselves and in others lots of times when you're basically vibrating. I mean, I'm talking about hertz per second, right? So I'm talking about brainwave frequencies. I'm not talking about these it's there's nothing airy fairy about it. It's really like a lot of people are running around and rushing around in beta, right? Which is this frequency that the best way I ever heard it described is, imagine you have a four-gear race car and you're driving it in first gear all day. Right? So you're pedal to the metal. I'm gonna get where I have to go no matter what. Yeah, you'll probably get there. It's very linear. It's, action breeds result, breeds action, breeds result. Yeah, okay, you'll probably get there, but there's a lot more wear and tear on the engine than if you start moving into some of these other frequencies. Now, beta has low range beta, high range beta. If you're in low range beta, you're already starting to open up to these new possibilities that I'm talking about. But when you're in high range beta, you are just a recipe for, a lot of cortisol and
Right.
and all sorts, and adrenaline that's just on just overproduction of these chemicals, right? Of these neurochemicals. So again, lots of times people say, well, it's they want the science part, and I thought that was really important because I work with a lot of really smart folks. You can't just say stand in front of the mirror and say I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. You've really got to get in there and with the science that matches what a lot of those spiritual traditions knew all along. I mean, if you look at the Eastern traditions and a lot of what came out of India, for example, and other traditions, what we're seeing is they knew these things intuitively, instinctively. They understood how these operating systems work. They talked about it in terms of chakras or energy wheels in the body. And what's happening over the last, I would say, especially the last 50, 60, 70 years is that science has been catching up, and especially more and more recently, where we're looking at these brain body scans and we're seeing, oh my goodness, these chemical messengers that we're sending down from the brain that are a response of these electrical impulses that we call thoughts, which most people are not actually actively directing. So you've got 50 to 70,000 thoughts of these or impulses of these electrical impulses every day. And there's literally sending these chemical messengers, lots of them, when you're holding on to them, they're sending them down into the different organs or energy centers of your body. So we can see this on brain body scans. We see them actually getting lodged in there. And then it's clogging up those systems. And people wonder, oh, what, my gut's hurting, or I've got irregular activity in my heart, all these kinds of things that are happening. But again, this is where we're catching up. This is where we're realizing that's not by chance. It's not by chance that it's been stored there. And there are very specific things that you can start to do to free up that energy so that you can be more in tune with this force that we've been talking about. And so it is important to bridge that gap, but it's important only in terms of getting you to a place where you start to open to these things. You don't even need to know that much about this to just say, oh, what if I just start to open and turn toward a new potential?
And well said. And with that being said, you know, people will always say mind, body, spirit, right? Mind, body, spirit. And but you talk about the beliefs, which is really the mind. We're talking about conscious, subconscious, superconscious. Um, how can listeners begin to reprogram the beliefs that literally are manifesting themselves into the energy, which then is manifesting itself into the dis-ease. I say dis-ease, meaning I'm in a hurry, or it then manifests itself into a side ache or a belly ache or a headache or whatever it might be. And I think these are common things, and I think it's probably common knowledge to the people in kind of alternative medicine practices, but maybe not a lot of people who still might be listening to the show where it isn't. So, how would you tell them right now if they were looking at beliefs to reprogram so they could create a more fulfilling and rewarding life?
Mm. So let's go back to the thought impulses. Let's go back to this. Again, they're electrical impulses. We don't know the origin of them, which I find really fascinating because neuroscientists have figured out a lot of stuff, but what they haven't figured out is where do these thought impulses, where do these electrical impulses originate? So we can't point to a part of the brain, for example, the prefrontal cortex, and say, oh, that thought impulse that you're having of my mother-in-law's this, it's coming from that particular part of the brain. We don't know, but what we do know is that the average person is having somewhere between 50 to 70,000 of those a day. And we do know that for most people, those are recycled thoughts. They're the same thoughts or roughly the same thoughts every day. So the formless, this electrical impulse, is informing the form. That's a really important concept to just wrap our heads around. The formless, which in this case, I'm talking specifically about the electrical impulse. There are
Mhm.
other formless activities happening, but these electrical impulses that we call thoughts and we latch on to either because we like them or we don't, okay, they are informing the form. Now, that piece is really crucial for what I'll say a little bit later. But holding on to that piece first, I want to say, please, 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 if you're listening and you're thinking about this, do not start at the level of the thought.
Can I say something real quick? I
Yes.
think one way for people to maybe relate to it is the invisible actually becomes visible. So the formless informs the form.
Hmm.
If the form is the visible, the invisible is like, well, we don't know where those thoughts are coming from. But the reality is, I think people can relate to that concept of invisible becoming visible because you, a great example of that would be, well, you're having a day, you know, the stress is mounting, the stress continues to mount, the thoughts of negativity around that occur, and then you blow up. Right?
Hmm.
You just like explode at somebody or you do something that you're not supposed to do. So if the formless informs the form, how do I change the form to make sure that it's positive?
Hmm. Well, okay, I'm gonna come right back there. First, I want to say, let's take a concrete example. Let's say a carpenter wants to create a chair. Okay.
Mhm,
The carpenter has to think about the chair, has to plan the chair, has to design the chair, has to put all of her energy into making this thought, this idea come into the physical form, right? So this is a great way of just saying, let's look at something really, really tangible, right? If the carpenter mid chair making decides that she wants to make a couch, uh-oh, now we've got to deconstruct everything. We got to make something else, right? We're all doing this, but there are subtle ways and less subtle ways. So let's talk for a minute. I want to go back to the point of please don't focus at the level of the thoughts, because imagine you're bombarded, you've got these 50 to 70,000 thoughts. If you're trying to reprogram the belief with, like I said, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, it's probably going to fall short, because what we need is we really need something else that's going to allow us to start working at that level. A lot of people say I think, but for most of us that's the equivalent of saying I beat my heart, because that process of those 50 to 70,000 thoughts, they're happening almost as automations. They're automatic. And so trying to change that wave without understanding some other things first is going to be really hard. I would urge people to consider stepping away from positive and negative, because it's really not about it's like Shakespeare saying nothing neither good nor bad but thinking makes it so. It's like that's just an electrical impulse. So if we can distance ourselves a little bit from the thought by recognizing it's an electrical impulse, and at that point, we do something really important, and this is where most people kind of miss the boat, or most of us miss the boat, is we've got to find ways of unblocking that stored energy, that accumulated energy of having so much repetition. I can't think of the word, but repetitive. I can't think of that. But when we've repeated
repetitive, yes.
thoughts, um,
That
sometimes
works.
my brain, also with other languages, it gets stuck on one word. It's like, "Wait a second," and then I'll find it in another language. Anyway, that repetition, right? So there's a lot of that. It's cumulative. You can imagine it like a calcification of a thought, which is also happening in the form. It's a calcification around an idea. So again, don't let's not start at that level, because it's extremely arduous. The process of learning to think is a very, very arduous undertaking. Most people will never go through that. Let's start at the physical level because this is stuck energy. So one of the things that I'll constantly tell people is shake it out. You know, I was listening. I went to the south of France a few, I don't know how many years ago, 5 years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I can't remember. And I did this retreat. And this woman there who had founded a movement called Koya, she talked about shaking. And she said, she was having us shake one of our hands really vigorously while she told us this story of a gazelle being chased through the wetlands by a tiger. And she says the gazelle gets away. However, the gazelle does not go to therapy for the next 10 years about this time that this tiger was chasing her. What the gazelle does is she shakes through every part of her body, releasing the tension, releasing the fear, and goes back to being a gazelle. Now, we were taught when we were growing up, sit still, don't move, don't do that, right? I'm asking everyone listening if they're ready for this invitation to ignore that completely and start shaking. And I'm talking about literal shaking out of the body, what's been stuck and accumulating there, so that you can start to deconstruct some of the constant thought patterns, which I talk a lot about in this second book. Precisely how to do that in really simple terms so that people can start that undertaking. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing once the mind moves from master to servant and starts
Well,
to
I think
serve
the
the force.
shaking is the
Yeah.
physical element that actually gives you the assertion or power over the other thought. So, in other words, it dissipates, it goes away. So, to me, your story, that story you just told about the lion and the gazelle, is a perfect example of that.
Mhm,
So, I got a question for you.
mhm.
There's energy around everything. We're talking about energy right now. There's an energy of love, there's an energy of money. But one of your chapters is make a lot of money. Okay. And, there's this whole energy about being wealthy or being rich. Many people struggle with the concept of wealth and self worth. Okay. What's the biggest misconception in your mind about people that have about money and or abundance in their life because they either choose to not accept it or they connotate money with evil or whatever it might be. But I'd love for you to enlighten us about
Mhm.
this concept of make a lot of money.
I love this one. I just gave a full interview on this for Learn from People Who Lived It, which is another podcast that I absolutely love. This Matthew Blades interviewed me on the frequency of money. And we got so much powerful feedback about this. I had financial advisors actually reaching out to me and saying, "Oh my God, you just summarized in one podcast episode everything that I've never been able to teach my clients about wealth accumulation." And I think one of the most important, since you're asking for kind of what's the main thing, I would say understanding that money is the word currency, for example, it comes from corriente, it comes from flow. So again, the minute you start getting into those ideas of money is this or money is that, you're sort of blocking off the flow. Imagine like you had a hose, right? And you start to just clamp down on it a little bit with some habitual thought patterns around it rather than being open to flow in your life. We hear this word flow a lot, so it becomes a little bit distracting. It might bring us to other places, but the idea is simply there is this abundance of wealth, and I don't mean that in terms just of financial wealth. The wealthiest people I know, they're like backpackers. I mean, there's some of the people that are closest to me, and you wouldn't know half the time if they're homeless or wealthy, like, and they're uber, uber wealthy. And because there's less, it becomes more about just where is life taking me. And the greatest wealth principle, I think, one of the greatest wealth principles to understand is that it is all in you. It's almost like you had the ruby slippers all along, right? The fact that you can really feel your way into this abundance of everything that lives within you and all around you. One of the exercises I used to do years ago was or lead people through was like just look outside, go outside. I'm looking outside this beautiful window right now, and there's just this plethora of life and all its manifestations, everything it's doing. And it's just so exciting to say, whoa, look at how life does it, right? And then relaxing again into this, it's in me. I can access this feeling right now of feeling secure, of feeling that I've got everything that I need, and starting to just gently allow yourself to experience that inwardly, as then the outward starts to come and meet it. Because again, you're electric and you're magnetic. Okay, you're sending out signals all the time. And again, we can call these thought impulses, but they're also sensations, and that then breed a very specific signal that you're sending. And then of course you're drawing back in that probability match. It is science. It's actually not, there's nothing about it that's woo woo. It's just the way you're designed. And so the more you start to feel inwardly what you are in that beautiful expectation of outwardly, you'll start to open up more and more to that.
Well, you bring up the value of flow, and I think there's many, and I don't want people to misunderstand, because there's this psychological flow where you timeless, spaceless, but there is an element associated with that same thing, with the flow of abundance in your life. That's the time when you're the most creative, as you just said. That's the time when you are accepting of new thought coming into you and you're open and receptive to that. And I think that is really the optimal time to make shifts in your life, changes in your life, to be accepting of things. I just was talking to a man, Bob Rosen, who wrote a book called Detach. And I think the reality here is, in the Eastern philosophy, we can get really attached here. And I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Uh, there's never a hearse that has a U-Haul behind it, right? And and I think many people are attached to all these physical things in their life that they create. It's like, I got a house, I got the car, I got this, I got that. And I think where you find the greatest level of happiness, as you were saying with your backpackers, is you wouldn't know if these people had anything at all other than their backpack and the clothes on their back, but they're as happy as can be because they haven't attached to all this, pardon me, shit that happens. So look, this comes down to living life by design. I used to teach a class on purpose, and we used to say, is your life on purpose or is it up by accident? And I think that comes down is, how can someone start creating a life that aligns with true desires instead of, as I said at the beginning of this show, societal expectations or expectations from wherever. So,
Mhm.
in your humble opinion, having taken this path in this journey, which is where you're speaking from, what would you advise somebody who's listening right now about finding that inner peace and finding a life that is fully by permission?
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot packed in there.
I know.
I would love to pull out 2 pieces of it. The first is desire. I'd love to for us to chat a bit about that, and then in response to the whole question. And the second piece is peace, that eternal peace that we hear about. And I love the word desire. It's funny in Buddha's teachings, he talked about desire being the trap, that all life is suffering and all suffering is related to desire, or because of desire, and desire is a trap, right? And so freeing yourself of desire. And I remember years ago in Anthony DeMello's work, I had read this what he said, he was talking about the teachings of the Buddha, and he said, really it's about your attachment to the desire. And after reading that, I realized the power of what he was saying, because desire in and of itself, as I like to think about it, is an evolutionary impulse. Okay? It's
Right.
coursing through you. It's a desire to be more. It's a desire to experience more. That is life, that is budding, that is firecracking throughout your whole system. It's the most sensacious. It's just sensational. It's a wonderful experience, right? So desire is how we're designed. We're designed to have those evolutionary impulses that are calling us to be and express more of this formless power that we've been alluding to throughout the interview. So desire in and of itself, I think great. I think that actually that translation of the Buddha's teachings
There
might have been a little bit off in that sense because
there'd be no procreation of the species if there wasn't desire.
as well, as well. So it's this idea, right, that it's the attachment to the desire. And the way that one could think about this is in this the beautiful way, and this was I again I'm paraphrasing from Anthony DeMello's teachings, but this idea that without this thing, I can't be happy. Okay. Without the relationship going this
Okay.
way, without the promotion, without my, I don't know, my clothes looking a certain way or my car being a certain kind of car, whatever, then I can't be happy. Okay. That, or as Shakespeare would put it, therein lies the crux. Okay. So the human the trap is without this I can't be, or I'm not okay if it doesn't go this way. And that's where we get ourselves into a big bundle of messiness. Okay. So it's not the desire per se. It's one also to the other point that you made in that question, because it, like I said, is really packed. But this other point was you'll feel the difference between the evolutionary impulse that's coursing through you and the excitement of that versus something that's been societally imposed. You'll actually feel it in your body. And the more you listen, the more that cue will become extremely clear to you of this is what, this is the thing that I'm really after. So again, embracing, acknowledging, loving the evolutionary impulse. The peace, the eternal peace that we hear about comes from saying, I'm also perfectly okay if it goes any other way. And by the way, to go back to the question of money, that's true wealth. Is like, I'm okay no matter what. And I don't mean okay as in the F word, as in fine. Okay. I mean okay as in I'm spectacular regardless of how this goes. And it's saying, "I do feel this evolutionary impulse. I'm nurturing it, I'm loving it, and I love everything that's happening." It's getting to that place, and that might seem really far off. I know for me in my life, that felt super far off for so long. I was very driven to get to the next thing, but what I kept realizing over and over, luckily, it was like, you keep smacking your head up against the wall, you'll eventually realize this isn't working. If you notice
Yeah.
how quick that turnaround of like, "Oh, this isn't as satisfying or as gratifying as I thought. Next, next, next." And eventually you might decide to get off the hamster wheel.
I like the fact that you say that, and I think there's an old Indian story that the punchline is good things, bad things, who knows, right? So in other words, oh, you just said about finances. Well, if it didn't go right, well, who knows? The reality is we don't know why that occurred, and we need to let go, and we need to know that we are fully abundant no matter what happens. That we can attract into our lives. They say people who've lost millions, made millions, lost millions, made millions is because they know how to attract that back into their life, right? It hasn't ever been anything. And you also said not bundling up flow, allowing flow to occur. And I think that is because people do like to damn things,
Mhm.
thinking, okay, I claim it, it's mine. That's what I
Mhm.
have. Right. Um, and so this comes down to this, sometimes uh, having a vocation versus having a living comes down to are people playing and having fun.
Mm,
Um, and you encourage people to have fun and play more. And I think that also encourages people to be more creative, use their creativity. You be open to that. Why is play, in your estimation, an important part of actually accessing the spirit within?
mm. Yeah, I dedicated a whole chapter to play in the second book because what I realized from my experiences, I had started to have these really phenomenal experiences. I didn't know actually if I was going to share them in my writings because they almost felt I felt a bit vulnerable to talk about how this happened also because I didn't know how it was possible that I was having these experiences. I didn't have them in any traditional ways in which people seek them out. I was having experiences of so-called or what you would call satori, and
Satori.
one of them actually lasted for 2 days, and I was trying to deconstruct, like, what happened there because I wasn't on anything, but I was complete bliss. I was Satchitananda. I was desireless. I felt, gosh, it was just the most, and I do share the writings that came through me during that experience. I share that because what I wanted to do, as I said, was deconstruct how the heck did this happen, right? And as far as I could tell, it was this really seeking. I was seeking that knowing. I was seeking that connection with this force source energy that's coursing through us. I was actively searching for it through my research, through my practices. And then the funniest thing happened. I sort of just let go of my attachment to finding it.
Mm.
And then I got really goofy. I just got goofy. I just got funny. I remember I was with one at the onset of one of these experiences, I was with a friend and I was just so playful and goofy. I was like, who cares? I just kind of gave up in the best way. And bam, the
Yeah.
minute I gave it up, I got it. And I gave it up in a really playful way, so I was thinking, "Okay," and then I saw this happening. I realized that was a pattern in my life, that lots of times I was, quote, unquote, "striving for something," and it was the moment that I relaxed around it and I got goofy, that thing just shot out, just shot up. And so so that's as far as I could tell was this play, which, when you again look at the Eastern traditions, this idea of Leela or divine play, it's like everything's playing around us, right? So why are we getting so stiff? And if we could loosen some of that stiffness through, some of what I was talking about before, and there are many other ways to do it. I talk about in the book, but it's if we can start to loosen some of that stuck, stagnant energy and we can invite in some playfulness, then I mean, actually, your whole world could shift.
I would say that that is the best advice you gave people on this podcast is to loosen up. Now, a lot of people would say to let go, but you were striving so much to find it. Then when you let go and became playful, it found you. And I often say people, say, well, I have a gratitude journal. And I say, I think gratitude finds you. You don't find gratitude. So the question then becomes is like the way you're looking at this story about seeking, pushing, striving, right? And the minute you played, it found you and you had this Satori experience, right? In other words, it was like, okay, this is wonderful. This is what I was seeking so hard to find. And I allowed it to happen and it found me,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Um, I always sometimes ask, I think when people are striving for that, that psychologically, what is it that are you either running from or toward? Or what are you chasing or what's chasing you? Okay. Um, so with that being said, going back a ways to your younger self, having gone through this amazing journey that you have as a soul on this pole and your spiritual transformation, what advice would you have given your younger self before you started this journey? And what advice would you give the listeners today to be thinking about, hey, how am I going to take this journey and be more accepting and less attached to the outcome?
mm. The one piece of advice I would give is trust.
Trust.
Trust everything. Trust everything that's occurring within you and outside of you. It's funny you talked about running away from things and running toward things, and one of the ways I like to think of that is everything you're running away from and everything you're racing toward is inside of you.
Hmm.
And so when you start to discover you have the treasure, the kingdom of heaven is within, you really again, you can relax more and more into that trust. But a younger version of myself might have railed against that a little bit I don't know that a younger version of myself could have accepted that advice at all, but I do know that that's where the treasure trove is saying, "Oh, just like I'm trusting in that force source energy to beat my heart, just as I'm trusting in it to send the electrical impulses down to my legs to have me take one step and then another, I'm going to consciously and actively direct the trust process around everything else and see what happens." Um, you also mentioned this other piece that I think is also extremely good advice, which is the gratitude piece. Sir John Templeton, who was arguably the greatest investor of all time, when he was asked the secret of wealth, he responded in one word, and it was gratitude. And it's really acknowledging like, "Whoa, there's a butterfly that just flew outside my window. Whoa, I get to talk to you today. This is absolutely marvelous. Whoa, I can take a walk, or I can lay down, or I can talk to friends, or I can go jump on a trampoline, or whatever that is. There are trillions of things when you start seeking, and seek and you shall find, right? There are literally I don't even know how great that factor is of just saying, "Thank you. Thank you. Like, thank you that I can listen to this. Thank you that I can invite in some of this information. Thank you that I'm ready for something new. Thank you for that new potential that already exists within me because I can feel it and I can imagine it." And that's the creative principle that Einstein was talking about. He's like, "What did we do? We got this all wrong. We created a society that revered the rational mind, which is so limited. Let it
Right.
go. Be grateful for what you can imagine, what you can image in, and just say, 'Wow, thank you.'" I love that.
Yeah, actually, in my book, Hacking the Gap, A Journey from Intuition to Innovation Beyond, I use that Einstein quote. I can't quite remember it exactly, but you paraphrased it
Yeah, good.
relatively close. But I want our listeners to give yourself permission, be
Mhm.
confident, be happy, be you. It's Cortney McDermott. She is the author of this book, also the author of another book called Change Starts Within You. You can look her up at her website. We will give you coordinates, all of you, to that. Here is the book. Court, it's been an honor having you on this podcast, taking this little bit of time to speak about the many experiences that you've had that hopefully can impart the wisdom to other people to say, if you take one thing from this, and if it was just the last thing she said around trust, just trust in yourself. That's the biggest permission I think that you could
Mm.
give yourself is trust yourself, right? Don't go toward doubt. Don't go toward fear. Don't go toward uncertainty. And certainly don't let the outside world tell you whether or not you can play or not. Play when you want to play. Be who you want to be. I know at times it's like, well, they're judging me, you know. Well, don't worry about who's judging you. The reality is have fun with it.
Mm.
So, any last words you'd like to give?
Just thank you so much, and also letting everyone know to check out your book, Hacking the Gap, which I read and I thought was absolutely phenomenal. I read it on a plane ride and on a recent trip, and it was really, really great. So thank you for having me on. Thank you so much to everyone who listened. It really says a lot about you and what you're ready for, and I'm excited to connect wherever that takes place.
Namaste to you, Court.
Namaste.
Thank
Thank
you. Have
you.
a good rest of your afternoon
You
and
too.
blessings to you.
You too.